Okay, and we are very pleased to have with us today Samantha McCoy, who will introduce herself, and I just turn it over to you, Samantha.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. My name is Samantha McCoy. I am an attorney. Prior to law school, I was a licensed mental health therapist, and I'm also a survivor myself, and that's what kind of led me into this work. Um, is there anything else, Peggy, before we get started that you needed to say?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so thank you everybody for joining. This is the Seeds of Hope and Legislative Advocacy, and I wanted to start just as a preface. Um, I'm not sure why my slides aren't moving. Here we go. As to why I am here. And very briefly, and not going into too much detail, but it was my own experience with a failed system. And I found myself in a situation where I didn't necessarily understand what to do and how to approach the legislative process because I myself had never been involved. I did not come from a family that had a politician or an attorney, and I myself at the time was not an attorney. And so I went on this venture to figure out how does one pass a bill, and is it possible for somebody who doesn't necessarily come from that background to pass a bill? And what I found is that there's a lot of things that will try to a lot of aspects that seem secretive. And when you actually get into the work and you get into the process, you realize that it's very attainable for someone, even if you're not necessarily associated with an organization, to be able to pass your own law. And so I want to give this information to you all in hopes that you're able to pass your own law, whether that is as an individual yourself or as somebody that's working with an organization, and hopefully demystify a lot of things that seem like you might not necessarily know how to approach something. I have personally been through all of the pitfalls and the trial and errors. At this point, I've passed several laws in several states. I've passed a federal bill, and I've also worked on a United Nations resolution that was signed into law. And so I am happy to answer any questions. Please feel free to take yourself off mute at any point to ask me to clarify whatever you would like. And then afterwards, please feel free to reach out to me, and I'm more than happy to answer any questions that you might have. So just to begin, I wanted to ask you all to just kind of reflect on why you chose to be here. Is it something that you might necessarily have wanted to come to because you're just interested in learning more about the legislative process? Or is there a bill that maybe you've kind of been stewing on for a while and just really would like the tools to be able to go forward and pass your own law? And this is a self-reflection, so you don't have to put it in the chat. If you'd like to put it in the chat, please feel free. Okay, so we're moving on to understanding the legislative landscape, and this, I want to preface, is Texas specific. You will find when you work in other states or if you want to pass a federal law, the process can vary and it is different, but the aspects that I'm going to talk about today are applicable in all of these, but I want to clarify how the Texas legislature works in and of itself. And so very simplistic version that hopefully, you know, this is a reference and a guide as you're moving through the legislative process to always refer back to. So first is a bill introduction. That is when a legislator, or what we call a sponsor, files a bill. And as soon as it's introduced, it is assigned a bill number and it is read for the first time. Um, Once it has a bill number and it's read, it goes to step number 2, which is a committee referral. It is sent to a relevant committee by the speaker or the lieutenant governor. And once it is assigned to committee, that is where you hear most of the time where testimony might come into play. And that is because they have public hearings in front of the committee it's assigned to. So for example, if your committee, it's assigned to the Committee on Criminal Jurisprudence, then that will be a chance where you're able to come and testify yourself in front of the committee, and amendments can also be heard at the committee. The committee also decides whether it goes to the next step or not. They can approve it, they can amend it, and they can also reject the bill. If it is approved, then a report is issued and it is sent to step number 4, which is a calendar committee. And they schedule the bill for a floor debate. And this just means that the entire chamber is present to vote on that bill. The amendments can be added at this section, and that's just something to keep in mind. But if it does pass the floor, so for example, if it's sent to the House and it passes the floor vote, it will go to the second chamber. So if it passes the House, it goes to the Senate. If it passes the Senate, it goes to the House. So it's always just kind of vice versa because they have to pass in both chambers. And the process just repeats in the opposite chamber. So you start from the committee referrals. It will be heard in committee at the second chamber. They will vote to approve it. It will be sent to a floor vote as well. Assuming it passes both the House and the Senate, that's when it will be sent to the governor's desk for a signature. The governor can veto it. In fact, I think he vetoed 26 bills this past legislative session, so it is something to keep in mind. But a veto can be overridden by 2/3 votes of both chambers. And this is something that I consistently go back to if I'm working through the process and maybe it's getting hung up or the bill itself is not progressing and I just want to learn more about maybe where it's at or where it needs to go. So the next step is brainstorming what you would like to address or solve. So this is just what are some legal loopholes or barriers to accessing justice that maybe you've come across? And I will give specific examples that I've personally worked on. One example that I worked on in Connecticut was banning the process of pelvic examinations on unconscious patients in a medical setting. And so it was something that survivors were coming forward saying that they were experiencing, and that was something that we wanted to ensure was addressed in the law. But it could also be that the survivors are consistently reporting that they are not getting a confidential advocate when they're coming forward to report an assault. I've also worked on bills in which there was the rape kit is technically paid for by law, but the survivor was not being told that their rape kit was paid for. So that was something that we wanted to ensure was enlisted in the law. And so I just want you to take a few minutes. Maybe there's something that you've come across yourself or something that you hear consistently that you think is a big issue. And just taking time to write it down. You're welcome to share it. You don't have to. Okay, so now that you have the idea of an issue that you've noticed and that you realize needs to be addressed, the next step is to determine how it could be solved. This is where you really want to start thinking creatively and strategically for a solution. This includes thinking more on the bipartisan lines, because it is, when you consider it in a bipartisan lens, that's how you ensure that you have a likelihood of success in the future. So for example, some of the issues that I've addressed in legislative context, performing medical examinations on unconscious patients for medical student training. So what is the solution to that? A solution would be to ban the invasive pelvic examinations on all conscious patients, but for necessary pelvic examination training for medical students, you must obtain explicit consent to do so from a patient. Another example is survivors are reporting interrogative practices by law enforcement when reporting sexual assault. So a potential solution could be to mandate the right to an advocate in the room. And the reason being that it's another set of eyes and ears, and it's also somebody who can call for breaks and also call out negative behavior. Another example is you hear survivors are still being asked to pay for rape kits, though it's mandated by law that they already don't have to pay for that kit. So what's the solution? You can require that survivors must be informed of their right to not pay for their rape kit at all. And they have to be informed by healthcare professionals, law enforcement, and advocates. And then the last example, it's not something that I've personally worked on, but it's a good idea. Survivors are re-traumatized by having to repeatedly recount their assault back to multiple agencies. So what is a solution? You can create a single narrative protocol to where survivors' initial statements are securely recorded and shared across agencies to reduce repetition. So based on the issue that you've pointed out and written down, brainstorm how you can resolve this issue. And I'm happy if you have an issue and you would like to talk or think out loud about a solution, feel free to come off mute or message me afterwards. More than happy to do so, but just take a few minutes to think about a solution to the issue that you wrote. Okay, so some things to keep in mind as well as far as what solutions you can offer. Um, is to consider whether there's a personal story that exists. So you always want to start with a personal story if there's, whether that's somebody that you know, people that you work with, or yourself. So if it exists, or bring written personal stories of those impacted. It is a huge mover in inspiring legislative work. Legislators love when there's a personal story behind something because it becomes not necessarily a number. But if there's no personal stories, that is okay. That does not mean that your bill is a bad idea, or that your um, issue doesn't need to be resolved. But you do want to come with valid research and statistics on the scope of your issue. You're going to be asked it inevitably what the prevalence of your issue is and what's being done to address it, if anything. So this is a time to kind of note that you need more research or statistics, or you need a personal story to go with what you're saying. And the third tip is something that I've found throughout my legislative advocacy always comes up, is they want to know what other states are doing. So for example, when I'm working in Indiana, they really care about what Ohio and Kentucky are doing. Same thing in Texas, they're really interested in what Oklahoma and Louisiana are doing. So if they are addressing the issue in some way and you can use some of it or parts of it, that is a huge mover. If not, it is totally okay to just use it states that are doing what you would like to do, and propose it, and you want to come with that information as well. But if you can get, if you're coming with California to Texas, it might not necessarily have the same sway as it would be if Oklahoma was passing it. And I just wanted to take an extra minute to just emphasize the power of storytelling in legislation. When you're coming with an idea and you know that you're going to have to do testimony, and you know that you're going to have to persuade a large group of people, storytelling can be and is incredibly important. So we know that research shows that people retain 95% of messages when it's delivered with storytelling methods. Um, this it's a it consistently comes up that they want to know if somebody personally has gone through X thing. They also increase comprehension and elicit empathy. They are just inherently persuasive, and advocates who share their stories often feel more connected to the cause. But even more importantly, when you have a story behind it, it mobilizes grassroots efforts far more than just giving statistics. But again, there is nothing wrong with just coming with statistics. The bill that I've talked about that I worked on in Connecticut for banning the practice of pelvic examinations on unconscious patients, I didn't necessarily have somebody that had experienced that, but it was a concern. It was noted as something that was occurring. And so it was purely coming with the statistics and the research to prove not only is this happening, but I have a solution that I can propose to make sure that this is done ethically. Okay. So now that you have your issue and your solution, you've thought about statistics, you've thought about storytelling, this is the key document that you are always going to use throughout the entire legislative process. It is called a one-pager, and it is purely why you do the steps ahead of time that I just walked you through is because it is exactly what your one-pager is. You are going to list the issue. You are going to list your proposed solution. You want to include other states that have done or are doing what you would like. You want to list any stakeholders or entities that you've garnered support from. And then you always want to end with a call to action. What do you want that person to do? So I put an example off to the side. This is an organization that I work with very frequently. And this is the one pager that we used this past legislative session to not only discuss what we would like, but to garner support for the legislative proposal we were presenting. So we start at the very top with just a very generic about the organization, what we do, what we care for. And then you want to go into, this is the issue. The Department of Justice recommends that all states retain forensic evidence for 20 years. We also included the stakeholders, that the department, the DPS was in agreement with our recommendation and was supportive. And we ended with Texans urgently need updated and transparent forensic evidence storage procedures so that access to justice does not depend on geography. And you can add in, graphics, but this document will go with you in emails and every single meeting. And everybody will ask you about it. It's also a good reference when you're doing drop-in meetings much later that the legislator can just refer back to your document. Who are you? What is your issue? And what are you proposing? And the next slide is similar. So I worked on the Take It Down Act, the federal bill that had recently just passed. And so this is an updated one pager that we used on the federal level. And as you're moving through the legislative session, you're going to update this document. So if you look at the top, we put passed in the Senate unanimously on this date. And we're now working in the House to try to get it. So this is a good reference, like, hey, it's already passed the Senate unanimously. Here's a list of all of our co-sponsors that we have on board. And again, this is a good example of exactly how you would want to do it. So the problem, what is the issue? Why is this legislation needed? And then what's the solution? It's the Take It Down Act. It's the bill itself. And here's exactly what it does. And again, we sent this throughout every single meeting that we had. We can attached it to every single email we sent. And so it is just a quick reference back. Does anybody have any questions on one pagers itself? Because this document is very essential. Okay. So once you have your one pager, the only other document that you would really need, and you don't necessarily need it, is to have a proposed legislative bill. Some states that I've worked in, they really want you to have your own drafted proposed bill to start off with. Texas, I've not come across that very often at all. In fact, most legislators want to draft their own bill. They have what's called the Legislative Council, and the Legislative Council's entire job is just to draft bills. So the sponsor themselves will reach out to Legislative Council to draft this document for you. However, it can be a tool that if you feel comfortable or if you just want to give it a go, it does not hurt you necessarily to have a proposed bill. In fact, it can kind of be like a talking point. It can be very impressive, and you can also just get out your ideal ideas of what you would like the bill to have. And so there's two different forms of a proposed bill. You want to consider, are you amending an existing bill or are you creating a brand new one? A lot of times amendments are considered the easier route because what you're doing is you're just taking a text and you're going to edit what already exists. So for example, and this is a bill that we got introduced this past legislative session with Representative Johnson. And so all we're doing in this bill is changing 5-year statute of limitations to 20. And so when you see the striked out language and the underlined is what is added. Everything else has already existed. So it's nothing that we've typed up, it's nothing we did, but we purely are just adding, it's 20th, you mark out the 5th. That's an example of an amended bill. An example of drafting your own full bill. I want to just preface, do not just get discouraged. You really do not necessarily have to have this, and you don't have to be an attorney. And like I said, the bill sponsors most of the time will want to draft it themselves in Texas specifically. But you can always use other states' bills to model what you're wanting. So for example, when we were working in Connecticut, we looked at what Connecticut bills normally are structured like. We just pulled some examples. We wanted to give it its own name. So we just wrote out exactly the name. And then we just wrote out exactly how we would like the bill to be structured ideally. And it did take some time and it does take some research, but it can be a mover and a tool to show the legislator that you really are knowledgeable and invested in this area. But if you just want to scrap everything else and just do the one pager, totally fine too. Are there any questions on amended or proposed bills? Oops, I apologize. So once you have your one pager, you have your issue, you have your solution, you have your statistics, your personal story, and now you have your documents ready. You're going to want to consider coalition building. And why I like to do this on the front end is it garners a lot more support and movement in your bill in a way that if you just show up and it's just you and you've not talked to any of the stakeholders or grassroots organizations, it can hinder your ability and limit your credibility. So you want to identify your allies. What are other grassroots organizations that might be supporting your issue? Are there survivor networks that you can tap into to get a survivor voice or someone who's been through this? Are there legal aid groups you can use or healthcare professionals or attorneys or whatever your issue has to do with? You want to engage them on a very basic level, and all you're wanting to do is present to them your issue and your proposed solution. This does two things. One, it obviously garners the support, but the second thing, and what I found most fascinating, is they can point out issues and things that maybe you hadn't thought of to strengthen your issue and your solution. They can give stronger solution proposals than maybe you thought of, or if they point out like, hey, this has a huge, issue with how you've drafted this, then that's something that you can take into consideration before ever involving a legislator. So I just want you to take a few minutes to just think of some allies for your proposed legislation and just jot them down. It doesn't have to be perfect, but even just generalities of survivor networks or a legal aid group that you can contact or a professional in that area. Okay. So now that you've gotten your allies lined up, now that you've gotten your documents, This is a way to amplify your legislative proposal before going to a senator or a representative. Change.org is absolutely amazing. I cannot say enough good things about change.org, and this is why. Not only is it a way that you can get a petition, you draft your petition and people can sign it, but they offer a plethora of things that I didn't necessarily know of until I started using them, and then I realized how influential it really is. They will pitch your legislative campaign to media for you for free. They have contacts. You don't even have to worry about it. If they love your idea or they just want, you're like, hey, I'd really like different eyes on this. They know who's interested in what, and you don't have to waste your time doing all the research and reaching out and cold calling these people. They do it for you. They also have a direct button on the petition for media inquiries. So all that person has to do, if the media is interested, is they click the button, they can send you a direct email, and then you're in contact with whoever has reached out. They also offer monetary support for selected legislative proposals. This was huge. I had no idea that they did this, but when I was working in Connecticut, they really liked the idea and it took off really well. And so we were selected to have some of that monetary support. And what we used that money for was printing petitions and dropping them off. We used them for rally materials when we were doing a rally at the Capitol. So it was just wonderful. They also offer a way for signees to donate to your movement as well. So they can directly donate and you don't have to set up a different account or do a Venmo or anything like that. And then you can also send your petition directly to legislators, which I thought was just absolutely brilliant. Printing off the petition is very powerful, especially if you have a lot of signatures. We printed them off and put them in these huge binders and delivered them. And I think it was just kind of very eye-opening, like, oh my goodness, look at all these signatures to have this many pages. But same impact if you're able to send it directly. And so what I wanted to do was quickly share with you all what our last petition looked like and how the page is laid out, just for your reference. I think can you all see that? I hope so. And so
Not yet.
this is what, oh, there it
We
goes.
can now, yes.
Okay, perfect. And this picture used to be different, but as you see, this campaign was victorious. And so we just took down and made it a very generic image. But if you look up at the very top, it says decision makers. That's the legislative staff that we directly sent it to. We listed it. This is exactly like your one pager. So this is why the one pager is so important. You list the issue, you list your research, and then you're going to list what you want them to do. So in addition to signing below, please consider reaching out to the Public Health Committee and then you give the email information. When you look down at the bottom, we put different articles so that we could promote the fact that this is a genuine issue and that people are caring about it. These are the decision makers we directly sent it to. This is where people can donate to you directly. And then the greatest thing is that as you're moving through the legislative process, you can send petition updates. So once it is victorious, once you do have it signed into law, it directly emails every single person who signed your petition an email updating them. So, and obviously you can share it on all these different platforms, but it's an amazing tool. It's something to consider, and especially if you can do it sooner than later in your legislative work, that's the best. Waiting for it to upload, I'm sorry. Okay. So the only other thing that I would consider at the very beginning is to also pitch to media. And this is effective, especially in the local media, just to say, this is an issue. This is what we care about. This is our petition. We want people to lend their voice. If you care about this, reach out to us or sign our petition. And that way you're building the public's momentum before you ever even walk through the doors of a legislative staffer or a representative themselves. Are there any questions on the change.org petition or pitching to media? And the very last thing that you'll do before you get into the legislative session is something I call power mapping. It is a tool to identify your key decision makers. You don't necessarily have to do this. In fact, the first few bills that I was involved in, I did not do this because I was not very well thought out in my planning and my strategy. But once I started doing it, the likelihood of success was occurring in a far shorter amount of time than it was when I wasn't doing this. And so I absolutely recommend it for anybody who's moving through and really wanting to pass their own law. And just for reference, here are some key players that you always want to keep in mind. Obviously, your senators and your representatives, committee chairs and members, very important, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Legislative aides and chiefs of staff, the lieutenant governor, also known as the Senate leader, the Speaker of the House, and then the governor themselves. And to clarify some terminology so I'm not confusing anybody, a bill author is also called a sponsor. This is the person who's going to champion your bill. This is the person who introduces it. And this is why this person is key to the success of your bill. You want to aim for a sponsor to be a committee chair or co-chair. But even if it's a member of a committee that you might get, the bill might get assigned to, that's huge. So for example, if I'm wanting to change something for survivor rights or criminal justice, I want to look at the House of Criminal Jurisprudence Committee, because that is the committee that's going to ultimately hear the bill. Yes, it's great to get other support, but if you don't have somebody on that committee who's sponsoring your bill, it does make it a lot more difficult. Your co-sponsors, it's another term that comes up a lot. You want to keep in mind the lens towards bipartisanship, but you're thinking of who can lead in both chambers, the House and the Senate, keeping in mind those committee assignments. But this is just somebody who supports the bill. They're not the author. They just are going to garner support, sign on to the bill saying, I endorse this bill, and they will help you move it forward as well. Legislative aides, that's just who works in the legislative staff with the representatives and the senators themselves. You want to build relationships with the staffers, especially those who manage those related portfolios, because they often, I've found out, know a lot more than the legislators do sometimes about the bills that are being heard and what they care about. So they are huge movers in what's going to happen. And then finally, and most importantly, are those committees. As I said, the bill is going to be referred to a committee for review. And this is where your testimony and amendments happen. So you want to be very strategic of who's on those committees and who you can target to potentially sponsor your bill. So I want to give an example just so I'm not losing anybody. This is an example of, well, my issue has to do with pelvic exams. So what committee should I target? I put the link up here and I'll show you what the website looks like in a minute. But literally, you can, there's two different ways. One, you can look through the list and just common sense say, okay, well, this has to do with public health. So that committee's probably going to hear this bill. There's also, if it has to do with medical student training protocols, that's going to be higher education. So you look for the committee on higher education. But if you're just like, I have no idea and I want to make sure I get the committees right, using AI is actually very genius to say, this is my issue. What committee should I propose it to in the Texas legislature? And so what that website looks like specifically, and I'm sorry, I keep stopping the share button, but I want to just make sure that I'm showing you what everything looks like and that there's no confusion in the process. And so when you type in, I'll give it a minute to upload. When you type in the committees, so this is the committees within the House. You can look down. There's agriculture and livestock, energy resources, election, environmental regulation, human services, insurance, public education, public health. And so you just look through this and try to determine who might be hearing your bill. And again, the cheat is if you're really not sure and you just need an extra set of eyes or another opinion, always feel free to use AI, and it can propose some different ideas for you as well. Any questions on committee selection or targeting your committee? Okay. You're on your very last step before you start meeting with senators. So I know it's been a lot of work up to this point, and you'll do this when the legislative session hasn't even started yet. So it does feel a lot more attainable when not everything's moving within the process. And so now you want to consider legislative sponsors. So you've considered your committees, you've thought about the committees that you might want to target, and now the specific legislative sponsors you want to target for your bill authorship. So I put an example. So using the exact same pelvic examination question, who in that House of Representatives would I want to target? And again, I wanted to illustrate, you want to target a Republican and a Democrat to be bipartisan. But as you see, Representative Oliverson is the chair of the House Public Health Committee. So for public health issues, he's going to be huge. He has a background in medicine. He sponsors health-related legislation. He would be a champion for your bill. On the Democratic side, keeping in mind the bipartisanship, Donna Howard was a former nurse, a longtime advocate for women's health. She serves on the Appropriations and Higher Education Committee, another huge person to keep in mind. So that's the House, and you always remember the second chamber, the Senate. So you want it to be the exact same thing. Find a Republican, find a Democrat. So Senator Middleton, he co-sponsored a bill that related to informed consent in healthcare. And then Senator Eckhart is a vocal advocate for bodily autonomy. She's a former Travis County judge, and she has public health and justice issues in her background. Another key, if you are feeling very overwhelmed and you're not necessarily sure, you can use AI to help you decide your legislative sponsors as well, just to do a double check on, am I thinking of this correctly? Have I not thought of somebody's background that maybe I should have considered? Any questions on power mapping and deciding who you would want to target? Okay. So now it's time to meet. So once you've done all of this work, and again, you want to do this before the legislative session starts. For Texas, they do biannual legislative sessions. So that means they meet every other year. They're not going to meet again until January of 2027. So right now would be the perfect time to start thinking about and doing the steps, getting the one pager, getting your petition up, you know, getting all of your research together so that once this legislative session starts, you're already in a great position. I want to say with a pro tip is to meet the legislators early. So do not wait until January of 2027 to start meeting with them. In fact, you can start meeting with them now. Maybe not right now because they're in special session coming up, but you do want to think about, okay, I don't want to wait until right before it's about to start. A lot of times the legislator already has what they're going to promote on their slated issues. And sometimes they are capped on their bill amount of how many bills they can introduce. So sometimes even if you have a great idea and but you haven't proposed it until December of 2026, they could just not have the capacity to help and to support your bill. So you always want to make sure you're starting the conversations early, well before session starts. So how does one do this? And I will say cold calls are not as effective. It's not that you can't do them. I just found that it is much harder to keep track when you're cold calling people. And the legislators find it very confusing because there's not a record to look back to track the conversation and where it's left off. So you always want to try to cold email to start. And this is, again, as I've tried to break it down, you just introduce yourself, list who you are. Importantly, if you're a constituent of theirs, they very much care about this. If you're not, that's okay. But always highlight it if you're a constituent. Otherwise, you can just say, I'm a Texas resident and I truly care about this issue. Then you want to do your issue and solution. You want to attach the one pager and or your proposed bill. And then this is important. Do not say, will you be my sponsor? Ask them for a time to meet next week. Just say, do you have time in your schedule in the coming weeks for us to have a quick call? That once you're in the meeting, that's your time to ask for the call to action. but when you do it in an email, it's very off-putting, and it doesn't allow you the time to build the relationship that you need to build. I will say, do not be afraid to email more than once. A lot of times they do get a lot of emails. Sometimes it just gets missed. People are on vacation, it didn't get picked up. There might be a change in staffing. So it is okay to pester, pester for progress, but keep in mind that you are trying to get them on your side. So you don't want to go overboard with this. There's no reason to be messaging them 4 times in a week. That will be very off-putting, and nobody wants to work with somebody who's that impatient, I would say. So just keep that in mind, that the key is to build a relationship with this person. So once you've done your cold email and somebody says, yes, I have next week to meet. And I will say, my experience, 99.9% of the time, they will respond to you and they will set up a time to meet. A lot of times, if it's not during the legislative session, it will be a virtual meeting. I have not noticed a difference where it was worse off in a virtual meeting than in person. So if they say, let's meet virtual, please don't take that as a sign of anything. A lot of times they go back to, if they're from Houston, they go back to Houston. So they're not in Austin area if you're in Austin. With all that said, so they set up a meeting with you, you go in, you want to have your documents printed, even if you've sent them ahead of time, because you're just going to drop them off. And again, if it's virtual, just attach it to the email and kind of keep that email chain going in one full email. Don't break up the emails, because then again, they can't keep track of the conversation and how it's flowing. Once you're in the meeting, avoid strong tones and aggressiveness. I've seen people who get very passionate and they really truly care about an issue, and that's wonderful. And there's nothing wrong with showing passion. But if you come off very aggressive or combative, that is going to off-put the representative and their staff, and they're not necessarily going to want to continue to work with you. So always remember, you want them on your side. You're trying to evoke a connection. So I put in an example of how you could handle walking into a personal meeting. You introduce yourself. Hi, thank you so much for meeting me. My name is Samantha McCoy. I'm so excited to meet with you today. You want to try to open up with a personal fact. I only do this as soon as they accept the meeting. I go and I look at their bio. Do they have family? Did we go to the same school? Is there some kind of connection that I can evoke with them? So, oh, I saw you went to UT, hook 'em horns, or, whatever. Or another one that if I have nothing in common with the person, or there's just nothing that I'm picking up on, I can just truly say, I see that you're dedicated, and you've dedicated most of your career to public education and public service. And I just wanted you to know that I'm so excited to be meeting with you today because of that. And that's just showing you looked up the person, you care about what they're doing, and you're targeting them for your sponsorship. And then that's when you go into, once you have that personal connection, you go into, what's your personal story? What's the statistics? What's your issue and solution? And you want to be ready to answer questions. But it can be very pressuring when they ask you a question on the spot and you don't necessarily know the answer, because you want to look like you have prepared. Sometimes it just happens. They ask really off questions that you're just not prepared for, or you haven't thought about. Never lie. Never come up with a statistic and say, oh, this happens all the time, if you don't actually genuinely know that. So you're trying to build trust with this person. You're going to be working with them through the legislative session. So it is okay to just say, thank you so much. I would love to do more research on that and actually type up something for you. Is that okay? And can I get back with you in the next week? It happens all the times. They don't blink an eye at it. And in fact, it shows that you are going to continue, and this is a partnership that you're going to work together with this senator moving forward. If you say you're going to follow up in a week or 2 weeks, make sure that you do it. Don't make promises that you can't keep, because again, if you're not reliable, they don't want to work with you. And then you end the meeting with the call to action. So this is where you say, I would love for you to champion this bill, given your expertise and your background. I think you are perfect to be the author of this. They are more than happy to be very honest with you. So it is fine if they're like, you know what, I'm not into this, or I don't have time for this. Always say, thank you so much for meeting with me. Is there someone else that you recommend? Is there someone else that you would consider being very interested? More times than not, if the person has said, I'm not necessarily interested, or I don't have the time to sponsor this, the next person that they give me is the person who ends up authoring the bill. So they have the insight of who is not only influential, but who also cares about each of these issues very deeply. So don't get discouraged with that. And then something that I always like to remind people is, do not be discouraged if you walk in thinking you're going to meet with the legislator and it's actually their legislative aide. Um, as I said, they often know far more about the bills that are going on. But on top of that, they hold a lot of power and influence. If you can get them to care about it and to bring it to the legislator themselves, that's somebody else that's on your side that's going to promote this and keep it going for you. Just be just as excited as if you were meeting the legislator. And on top of that, you don't have to change. So if you did all this research and you found out they went to UT, you don't have to go in and be like, man, I can't say that. I don't know what to say because I don't know this legislative staffer's background. Just say, oh my goodness, like, I am so excited that, Representative Smith was a UT Austin graduate. I am too. I saw his dedication to public service in his career. That is why I wanted to meet with your office so badly. That just shows, again, that you've done your research. It builds a contact, and it also shows why you chose their office to contact initially. And then you want to follow up with a thank you email within 24 hours. I normally wait a couple hours to respond. I don't do it immediately. But just a summary. Thank you so much for talking to me today about XYZ thing. This is the to-dos that I promised it before X date. So I promised to research this issue more specifically to answer this question. You will hear from me in a week or two. If there's anything else I can do in the meantime, please feel free to reach out. This is where you're going to continue that email chain, and it's going to be a process that you can continue the conversation through that. If they've said, I'm not interested in sponsoring, but go to this person, always send a thank you email still, because you never know who might co-sponsor the bill. So they could sign on and support the bill, they just might not be the bill author. And that's the same thing. You just say, thank you so much. I appreciate your recommendation to contact X person. I look forward to your support as this bill progresses forward, and leave it at that. So is there anything else as far as just the general meeting? And to clarify, this is for, you're trying to get a bill sponsor. This is the very beginning process. You're just trying to get your lead person. Are there any questions about meetings specifically? Okay. So now you have your sponsor, or two, you never know. So what now? This is where you actually get to celebrate. So all this work that you've done, you now have somebody, a whole staff of the legislators that are working alongside of you. So this is going to alleviate a lot of work that you've had to do on the front end. So they are going to send the request to the Legislative Council to get your official proposed bill. They are going to get the bill introduced. They will get the bill number once it's introduced. There's nothing that you have to do once you have their support and they say, yes, I'm filing it. They will also provide insights on the next steps. So, for example, they could be like, thank you so much. Make sure that you get bipartisan support. We really need a Democrat on this bill right now, or we really need to plan ahead and make sure that we get somebody in the Republican Party to support this. Can you work on that? And that will be your job to continue the meetings. But this time, what you're doing is looking for a co-sponsor. You're not looking for a bill author anymore. And you want to be very clear on your terminology between bill author and co-sponsor, because they do mean very different things. So once it's been introduced, you have this legislative staff support, and you're just trying to get co-sponsorship. These are drop-in meetings. This is not necessarily where you have to do in-person meetings or very long meetings like you were with the bill authorship, but they're just as important, because you're trying to just get as many signatures to sign on and co-sponsor the bill as possible. There's no limit to the number of co-sponsors that you can have. The more you have, the better. And keep in mind that you're targeting all the relevant committees, as many people as you possibly can, and also the bipartisan lens always. Okay. So what does a drop-in meeting look like compared to the bill author meetings that we just previously discussed? It is purely dropping in to their office. And this is once the legislative session has started, right? So the bill's already been introduced. You have the bill text to be able to drop off and say, Senator Smith is sponsoring my bill. We're just hoping you would support this bill as it moves forward and sign on as a co-sponsor. It's an elevator pitch. So you want to have an elevator pitch for these drop-in meetings. You can practice with loved ones or in the mirror, to your animals, whatever you feel like doing. And it is 30 to 60 seconds. You don't have to have a scheduled meeting to do a drop-in. They're always I say always, there have been 1 or 2 times that I've not caught anybody in the office, but generally speaking, there's always going to be at least one legislative aide within the office when you drop in. And so I will schedule a full day where I'm just like, I print off all my one pagers, I print off the introduced bill, and my goal is to just go to the Capitol and meet with as many people as possible. And I just go down the line of offices and I'm just, hello, thank you so much for your time today. My name is Samantha McCoy and I'm here about XYZ. And so this is just an example of a elevator pitch. I'm here as a survivor of sexual violence to ask for your support on a simple but critical issue, the banning of non-consensual pelvic examinations on unconscious patients in Texas. Right now, it is still illegal for medical students to perform these exams without explicit consent, something most people would be shocked to learn. This practice violates bodily autonomy and trust in our healthcare system. Can I count on you to help lead this effort? And they could say, well, we've got to talk. Most of the time, the legislative staff's not going to be like, yes, because they obviously need to talk to the legislator themselves. But you drop off the one pager, you drop off the printed introduction, and then you always leave some form of a way for them to contact you. That was something I messed up early on, was I dropped off all this information, and then I realized I had no way for them to follow up. So even just writing your email address on the one pager, having some way that they can contact you moving forward. If you feel really passionate or you really like the conversation, take one of their cards from the office and just follow up via email. I love dropping in, here's an electronic version of all the documents. You know, when can we follow up on this conversation to see if legislator X wants to support this? I actually like the drop-in meetings more because it's just more free-flowing. It's very quick, fast, and it's really just like, this is what this is about. This is what you can expect. We just want your support on this. And a lot of times you do get a lot of co-sponsorship from that. And again, your bill author can give you ideas of who's most important to target or who you might want to spend a little bit more time focusing on with these drop-in meetings. Is there anything else or any questions that anybody had on drop-in meetings for co-sponsorship? Okay. So you have your bill author, you've been working on co-sponsorship. Your bill is going to automatically be assigned to a committee. It's not something you have to request. Now, I will say there are very, very occasional times, not very often, but what can happen is it can be assigned to a committee and then it doesn't get a hearing. So it's totally fine if this happens. All you have to do is look up, and it's all on that website that I showed you as far as the committee. Once you click on the committee, it will show you every legislator that's a part of that committee. All of their email addresses are public information. It's not something you really have to dig very deep for. But you message those committee members and say, this bill was assigned to your committee. House Bill 2022 was assigned to your committee. I see that it's not set up for a hearing yet. I would love to request that this be urgently heard because so many Texans care about this. Here's a link to the petition of the 1,000 signatures I have to support this bill. More often than not, this isn't an issue. It gets assigned a hearing. However, if it does get caught up, do not get discouraged. It's just a matter of urging and just letting the committee know, like, hey, I'm here. Hey, this is the bill I care about. And these are all the people that are backing this, that are watching what you're doing. And the committee is where the bill will be heard. So this is where testimony comes into play. And there's a lot that I could say about testimony because it is such an impactful, emotionally taxing process, but it's also very fulfilling. Um, so, uh, for general context, anybody can testify for a bill. It's open to the public. You show up that day at the hearing. They have little kiosks at the Capitol. You just type in your information. My name is Samantha. This is my address. Yes, I promise to tell the truth. And then it'll say, are you in opposition or support of House Bill 2022? And you would obviously put in support of your own bill. Hopefully you would put in opposition, but so once you type that in, it'll say, do you represent anybody? And that's when you can say, I represent myself. I always just put self. But if you're there for TASA, for example, you would say, I'm here on behalf of TASA talking. And so once you have filled out the kiosk thing, that is the entire process. You just walk into the committee room and the committee will go ahead and get started. And they will call you up individually by your name. And then you'll have to repeat, I'm for or against, and I represent myself. And then you go into your testimony. Something to keep in mind before you get to this process is that there is a potential that there could be opposition testimony. It is okay. It does not mean that your bill is a bad idea. It does not mean that your bill is going to stall. All you have to do is be strategic and learning and come with a curious mind as to what they might necessarily be opposing. Is it something that maybe you hadn't thought of that's a really good point? Or is it just like we just fundamentally disagree on this issue and it's just going to be heard? And that is okay too. It's just keeping in mind what might be coming down the line just so you are further prepared and so you can create and craft your testimony to maybe address the opposition's testimony a little bit more strongly. Sometimes the bill author will give you the heads up. They'll say, hey, this person's been calling my office or this organization's been calling my office and they are not happy with this bill. Good information to know. And you just kind of go back to, is there a way that I can craft this, my testimony to strengthen our points and to show our reason as to why this solution is the best solution. If it's not possible to eliminate opposition or there is no opposition, even better, you could just start preparing your testimony. Unfortunately, with testimony, you find out very late in the game. So I've gotten 24-hour notice. I've gotten 48-hour notice. I've gotten 72-hour notice. It just happens. That's something that sometimes it depends on who your bill author is. They're very on top of it and their staff is on top of it. They'll shoot you the message. Other times it's just kind of like, oh no, we missed this and this is coming up. Can you be here tomorrow at 8 a.m.? You also want to keep in mind that just because it's called at noon doesn't necessarily mean it's going to start directly at noon. Sometimes they start upon adjournment, and that just means once they adjourn their next meeting. And so you could be sitting there till 4, 5 p.m. before the committee even gets started. Something to keep in mind, you want to block off the whole day, ideally, so that there's no conflict of time and having to run in and out. Other must-knows is that you're limited to 2 minutes, a maximum of 3. I always try to keep it within 2 minutes. 3 minutes is normally reserved for if you're invited to testify. So if the bill author themselves invite you to testify and say, I'm putting you down as somebody that I want to testify on this, great, you get 3 minutes. Otherwise, you have to stick to the 2. It will go by incredibly fast. And the committee chair will cut you off if you try and exceed that time. Some are nicer than others. They will let you kind of finish what you're saying. Others, there's a little blinking light, and as soon as it lights up, or a beeper, and once that time goes off, you've got to stop talking. You get to finish your last sentence, and that's pretty much it. This is why practicing over and over and over again is so important, to make sure that you are not even close to exceeding, because you want your 2 minutes to be worthwhile. And there is nothing wrong with writing your testimony. I've seen where some people think they have to memorize it, and then they get up there and realize it's far more anxiety provoking than they were ready for. And sometimes they forget what they were going to say. I always have something written, and it is okay to just stand up there and read your testimony. It's perfectly fine. The whole point is to get across your message and do it in a way that you feel comfortable with and that you can get out in time. The committee members are allowed to ask you questions. Something I wish somebody told me ahead of time is you do not always have to answer those questions. So I have been in the unfortunate situation where someone asked me a question. I really didn't want to answer it. It was a very personal question, but I had no idea. I could say, like, thank you so much, but I'm not ready to answer that, or I would like to answer that in private. It is okay to just say, thank you so much. I love that question. I'd actually like to go research it more myself. Can I get back with you and email the committee with what I find? Or thank you so much. I'm happy to meet with you personally to discuss that after this. I appreciate you understanding. And it's not even a thing. A lot of times they will not ask questions, but they always surprise me with the random things that they ask and when they ask. So just something to keep in mind. Another thing is that the press are allowed in. And you should know that the testimony is recorded and archived forever. And that's a true statement. I'm not being dramatic. It really is archived forever. So when you're going in front of the legislature, keep that in mind. If you have other survivors who are testifying, make sure that they know that the press are there and it is recorded. And if you want to look at other testimony to watch how members of that specific committee respond, so let's say you're being heard in the Criminal Jurisprudence Committee, all of their archived hearings are on the website, and it will say what legislative session. So you can look at prior legislative sessions, but what's most helpful is if they've already heard something this current legislative session, because those are the people you're going to be in front of. You can see, do they cut people off? Are they asking hard questions? Is one person leaning a specific way and you know they're going to be combative, and you can go ahead and prepare for that. It's a great tool just to be more prepared and know what you're walking into. And your testimony, as I said, you'll present yourself, you're introduce yourself, you have to state your position on the bill, in favor or against the bill, and whether you're representing an organization or yourself. You want to make sure that you make the testimony personal. I always think back to, like, why did I start this? Why am I here? Why did this matter to me in the beginning? It's okay to use statistics in your testimony. In fact, if it's a very strong statistic, I've seen legislators hook onto it very quickly, and they use that as they're promoting the bill and supporting the bill as it goes on. But to stand up there and read 12 statistics is not the most compelling use of your time. You have to look back and remember that the personal stories are what moves things. That's what gains the momentum. And you only have 2 minutes. So pick a strong statistic if you want to use one, and the rest can be in a written form. You can provide written if your testimony is longer than 2 minutes and you just want to give the committee members something else to look at. Research articles, statistics, whatever you might not necessarily have had the 2 minutes to do. As they'll call you up, you'll walk up and you literally just hand each of the committee members your copies. And that's something that they can take back with them, and that's okay to do. I don't often do it, but if there is something where I feel like there's a really strong research article that addresses it, I will drop that off and right before I speak, so they have something to refer back to. And then always keep in mind that you want to use respectful, nonpartisan language to maintain the credibility and avoid hostility. If you do not want to testify in person, that's fine. You can do written testimony. What that requires is that you're going to email the committee members, or at least the committee chair and co-chairs, directly with your testimony. This is also great if you have other survivors who might not be able to come to the Capitol. You can have them write their personal testimony and submit it in support of the bill, even if they're not able to come to the Capitol for you, or at that time, if it's too late or 48 hours notice isn't going to cut it for you. Okay. And then this is sample testimony, though I realize that I didn't test the audio and I'm not sure it'll work. But what I can do is this slide is going to be sent out anyway. This is the time that you'll just run the clock to, and you can watch a sample testimony that was saved and archived that I found was really impactful this past legislative session. And you can also see how the committee works, how they call people up. You'll sit, you'll say your name, you say your testimony, and then the time limit expires. So just a reference for you to come back to. So after the hearing, it can be a lot. So please take care of yourselves. I normally plan to have the day that I testify and the day after I testify blocked off. If it's not possible, I try to make the next day as limited as possible in the demands on my schedule, because it can be surprising, even if it didn't directly happen to you, how emotionally exhausting that process can be to hear other people's stories and to just be in that room. It's also very emotionally charging because you care about the issue and you're there, and these people are going to vote and decide whether your bill progresses or not. So don't think that you're just going to jump into the next day and always be on top of the game. So keeping that in mind. What I found in Texas, some places in some states, they will vote in front of you. So after the public testimony concludes, they'll go down, I, or, they'll say, no, I don't support the bill. And unfortunately in Texas, what I've noticed is that they vote later. So most of the time, they're not going to be voting in front of you. Some people like it that way, some people don't. I don't necessarily like the anticipation of waiting, but they vote outside. They'll let you know whether it passes committee or not. Your sponsor will definitely let you know because they're going to be excited that it passed too. And then that's when it will be called to the floor vote, like I said, at the very first slide that we did. And then it goes to the opposite chamber and you start the process over again. So you'll start the drop-in meetings. You will start the committee hearings. You will start the testimony, because it will also have to be heard in the Senate or the House, whichever one it wasn't heard in originally. This is also where you want to tap into public pressure and media. I cannot tell you how many times it starts to it'll zoom through the House, for example, and then it gets to the Senate and it starts to stall. And there's not a lot of progress and things are getting, anxiety provoking. Submit op-eds. Op-eds are wonderful to say, this is the issue. I was here and this is what I testified for because this is going on and this is not okay. Please call your senators, or please call the members of the Committee of Criminal Jurisprudence and urge them to hear this bill immediately. All of those things are wonderful motivators to get the bill moving. Also using your petition, update your petition, let them know that you have more signatures, drop off the petition and have printed copies. Some people hold rallies. It's whatever you think you can do to really get the public very interested in what you're doing off of social media. Social media is a great tool, but I see one thing that I see a lot is that there's too much emphasis on what's going on in social media, and representatives and senators oftentimes might not necessarily be as tapped into that, especially during the legislative session. So if you can drop off hand-delivered items, if you can bring in written testimony, if you can continuously have your friends or your organization be calling the offices, that's what moves this further along in a much quicker fashion. So you'll continue the meetings and you pressure inside the Capitol as well as using that. Now, once it passes both chambers, so you've gone through the process in the House and the Senate, or vice versa, the Senate and the House, that's when it goes off to the governor's desk. Sometimes you have to request a public bill signing. There's nothing wrong with it. That doesn't make you weird to want you to have a public bill signing. In fact, a lot of times they just automatically do it. But if you feel like I really care about this issue and I'm not sure it's going to, you can always ask your sponsor to request the governor's office to hold a public bill signing. Or you yourself can reach out to the governor's office and say, I was instrumental in this. I really care about this issue. And I feel like a public bill signing would be just absolutely wonderful to ensure that the Texas residents know what this bill is and can see it passed into law. And it really is just a celebratory moment. It's not necessarily something that you have to plan for. You don't speak. You literally, as I put the picture up here just as a representation, like you go around a circle behind this is the governor of Louisiana at the time, but you go behind them, they sign the bill, and people take photos. You don't have to invite the media. They show up regardless. I don't know who tells them, but it's not something you have to worry about. And then you want to update your petition to just literally say, we won, victory, this is what happened. And it just shoots out an email to everybody. And it truly is something that I find it was the most healing thing that I've ever done, to be able to pass a bill and to know that all of this hard work was for a reason, and that no one else is going to have to go through X thing that I fought, or other survivors had fought for. Um, so it's very doable. It's honestly, when you've done it so many times, it starts to be almost like just memory. You just keep going over and over again. And honestly, this is like, I really wanted to make this a blueprint of how you can just use this to continuously reference, to go back to and say, okay, I'm stuck in this section. What do I need to do? And so I'm going to be sending out the slides to the conference members, and they can send them out as well. And I just wanted to touch on just a few more things. I know we're getting closer to time. Avoiding burnout is very important. My first bill that I passed was, I was in law school. It took 3 years to get that bill introduced, passed, and signed into law. And after it was signed into law, I realized how much I hadn't taken care of myself during that process. And I had to take a few years off because it was just too much. And I hadn't prepared myself properly to sustain the work that I've done. Building a care plan, I call it scheduling joy, but I literally schedule joy in my schedule every week. So is there an hour on a weekend that I can just do something, go to a museum, go to a park, go lay out, next to the pool or something, and just making sure that it's on my schedule so I don't forget. It can be so easy to just get wrapped up in like, I've got to do this, I'm behind on this, but also writing down little wins. I remember sitting there writing down like, this representative's office actually replied to me. And like, that's something to be excited about. And yes, in the grand scheme of things, it's like, oh, I've got so much to do. But it was that moment of taking the time to say, wow, like I'm doing this. It is progressing. I am making progress. And I just have to keep focused and keep going. If you're working in a team of even just one other person, and I strongly recommend just finding one other person that can just like be your cheerleader, if nothing else. But if there's a way that you can work in a team to do this, if you're getting exhausted, switch roles. So have somebody that, if somebody's running the petition and you're just going to all these legislative meetings and you're like, I can't do this anymore, switch. Have you start running the petition, you start doing the more of the creative outlet work, and have somebody else go into those meetings to kind of alleviate some of the pressure of just consistently having to go through this. Staying connected, it's part of that coalition building. When you have other people in your side and within the organizations that are fighting for you, it is easier to get more excited, and you have more people to just celebrate big and small things with. And then revisiting your why. So why I brought this up in the very beginning, why are you here? Keep a note, a photo, a quote, something that reminds you of why you started this, and continuously reference back to it in those moments that can be hard. I don't want to say that it's not a challenging process, but it is doable, it is attainable, and it is something that I feel like so many people miss out on the opportunity to really make a difference because they just get scared or unsure of themselves or the process in and of itself. And so always remember why you started this, always continuously tap into other people. Know that if it's a bad situation or it's just a bad day or a bad meeting, that does not mean that you're bill is doomed. I remember walking into initial meetings when I first started, again, very, very new at what I was doing, and I was trying my best, but there was things that I just did not know. And I remember being told, like, this is never gonna pass. This isn't gonna work. Like, you're doing this, thank you. It's unfortunate that that's happened, but no one's interested in this. You have to just say, okay, thank you so much for your time. I am going to go to the next person. And you just keep going, because if I listened to every person that told me it wasn't going to happen, I would have never gotten as far as I've gotten. And the same thing is going to apply to you. Find your cheerleaders, find the people that support you, and that's all you have to focus on. And one last note that I want to make as far as working with survivors in general. If you yourself are a survivor and you're working with other survivors, or you're an organization that's supporting other survivors, there are trauma-informed ways that you can work on legislative advocacy, keeping in mind some of these things. So preparing a survivor of what to expect. So always telling them if there's going to be media present, always telling them that something's going to be recorded, letting them know that somebody might come in and testify in opposition, and preparing them as much as you can for what might be triggering language, might be a triggering question. The more information you can give the person, the better. You also want to be clear on the legislative process and that it can be last minute. Some things are just not going to be in your control. So framing it as, oh yeah, this is, for sure going to happen on Tuesday, and it doesn't happen on Tuesday. Or you call them, oh my goodness, we need you at the Capitol tomorrow. That's something that if you're making sure that you're intentional to begin with, they know that it's just a very last minute process and it's not something that you're controlling. And then do not overpromise outcomes. Telling a survivor this is going to be a slam dunk, no one's going to oppose this, all of those things. I know that can be, it can be tempting to use that language because you want the survivor to feel comfortable, but what you're actually doing is you're setting them up for failure, because if something does go wrong, it's just not going to sit well, and they're going to turn it on themselves and say, well, it must have been my testimony that caused the issue, or it must have been something I did. And we want to avoid that as much as possible. And then letting the survivor determine when and whether they want to share their stories and at what capacity. Also avoid sensationalizing or reducing experiences to a single moment of trauma. Preparing to respond with empathy and respect, especially in situations that this might not have happened. So you prep the survivor ahead of time before you go into the meeting. If something happens during the meeting, you're able to respond with empathy and respect afterwards. Reset the survivor, let them know it's not their fault, that's not something they did. Whatever you can to ensure that they know that you respect them, you support them. You also want to obtain written consent before sharing any personal story. So if you're adding in a personal story to an op-ed, if you're mentioning it to media, whatever the case may be, get written consent to do that. And they should have the right to withdraw their story at any time. When you're working with media, it can be tricky. Something that I didn't necessarily prep for was that sometimes journalists are not the most friendly always. So they might say, oh yes, whatever you say, we'll listen to. Then you spill your guts and you realize, oh my goodness, I said too much. And they say, oops, sorry, we're journalists. We're going to publish whatever we want. So be very selective if you're involving a survivor and a journalist, or the media in general, ensuring that you have control, you trust the person, they've been vetted. It's not something you're just throwing someone in and that person's going to spin the story and harm the survivor inadvertently. And then obviously accessing your support networks after all of this. So there is a QR code for you all to take a survey afterwards. And I love this quote so much. Your voice can alter generations, boldly use it for good. I hope you all feel like you have the tools and the ability to pass your own law. If I can do it as a law student, knowing nothing and having no background whatsoever in legislative work, I 1,000,001% believe all of you can go out and pass your own law. My contact information is at the very bottom. If anybody is interested in just like, if there's an idea, if something comes up during legislative session, you're like, I'm not prepared for this, feel free to reach out to me I don't charge anything. I genuinely care about people making a difference and using their voice. Um, so I'm happy to brainstorm ideas. I'm happy to run anything by if you need a media pitch or um, whatever. Please feel free to reach out, and I'm happy to help. Um, are there any questions? I know we've got 9 minutes left. Is there anybody that has anything that they would like to ask or pose?
Please feel free to put questions in the chat as well if you'd like to.
Something that I would love to see more of is more high schoolers and college students also doing legislative work. So I noticed that there was quite a few college students that came to the Capitol this past legislative session and testified, and that was really awesome to see them getting involved. But um, just very excited for people to actually have this information and be able to pass their own laws and make a difference.
And thank you so much, Samantha, for being here. It's a wonderful workshop. Folks, please, there's a link to a survey also in the chat if you would do that. And then please feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question or put a question in the chat. And I'm actually going to stop recording now.